Dan Grabski grew up in upstate New York and has degrees in both mechanical engineering and electrical and computer engineering from the University of Rochester. He spent a few years engineering in IndyCar racing while in Indianapolis, then moved here to Portland in 2009. He then got into controls engineering in the semiconductor industry. He eventually found his way into the tech industry at Apex FinTech Solutions as a software engineer before transitioning to the technical writing team where he is now. In his spare time, he's a competitive bridge player, a national championship winner in his category in night orienteering, and is happy to give recommendations for trail running in Portland. For his first time speaking at a conference and the last talk of the day, please welcome Dan. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So, hi everybody. Yep, welcome to Zen and the art of automanually creating API documentation in inquiry into process. I was hoping I'd make it through that whole thing without stumbling, so first success of the day. So once again, I'm Dan. Like they said, I've got a pretty unique background. Every time I go into a job interview, I always get the statement, oh, I've never seen a background this different before. I started out actually in mechanical electrical engineering, did a lot of different control stuff, worked my way into IndyCar racing, actually did fuel strategy for Danica Patrick's IndyCar win in Japan, and a little red arrow is me in Victory Circle. Got done with that, moved out to Portland, worked my way into controls engineering where I was the person who knew how to write, so I had to write all the manuals. Wrote manuals for about 60 different pieces of equipment in 2 or 3 years. There was a lot of copy and pasting involved in it. Then got into the railroad industry for a while, and then finally found my way into software engineering. And again, I was the one who was writing a lot of the documentation, so I got transitioned over to the world of technical writing after that. So what are we trying to do for our goal in this talk? I wanted to write this because I wanted to share at least some of the stuff that we've been learning about how to create better API documentation. And when we think about that, like, what are the qualities that we really want to have that we could say, okay, this is better? We want it to be consistent. You know, if we've got a lot of different microservices happening or different teams working on stuff, we want it to all look like it's the same group of people who are doing the same thing in the same direction. We want it to be clear. I mean, that's one of the main things we're trying to do is make it so our customers can read it and not end up having to ask a lot of different questions. And we want it to be easier to maintain. You know, it doesn't do us any good if we're spending 3/4 of our time having to make changes or help do support stuff or anything like that. So, you know, given all those goals that we're trying to hit, what are the roadblocks that we are trying to get better at and trying to deal with? What are other groups trying to deal with? One of the big things is we don't always get up-to-date documentation out that parallels what's happening in the dev world. I know I've run into this a lot where, okay, a dev team is making a change and like we're not hearing about it quickly enough, or something breaks and then comes back around to us, and we can't necessarily parallel those changes as quickly as we want to. One thing that I alluded to already is multiple microservices. There's a lot of companies going to a microservice architecture or have been for a while. Whatever is going on behind the scenes, our clients don't necessarily need to know about that. They want to know that if there's a field that says user ID, it means a user ID in wherever you're putting it in, no matter what team or what microservice it's coming from. A lot of devs don't have a lot of technical writing experience, and sometimes that ends up coming across as not being as client-friendly as we'd like. I personally was pretty lucky when I went to University of Rochester. They instituted a program where every single engineer, mechanical, electrical, chemical, everything, were required to do writing-intensive courses as part of their engineering work. We literally had classes where you would do an engineering paper and then an English professor would be responsible for half of the grade for your paper. So I know I've got a little bit of a biased background on that one. And then sometimes support for documentation is hard. Like, I think I'm preaching to the choir saying that in front of everybody here. A lot of times, sometimes the documentation is at the very end of the process, and people want to come up with timelines, deadlines, which is all great. And let's say, okay, I want this thing to be done by July 1st. Certain teams will say that, okay, my part needs to be done by July 1st, not realizing that other stuff down the line has to happen, and sometimes we're farther down the line than everybody else. So, quick overview, what would be an ideal solution that we could work our way towards? So, first thing, you'd want to create some kind of API documentation that would go out in the world. Ideal world where birds are whistling in the trees, developers, documentarians all get together, all your documentation is in code, everything is beautiful. Then you generate, say, an OpenAPI spec file. Say your CI/CD pipeline for your code takes all of that beautiful documentation that's in the code, generates an OpenAPI spec file every time you push a PR to GitHub or whatever you're using. And then you display it, you render it somehow. You can use that OpenAPI spec into README, Swagger, Apiary. There's tons of different solutions for this, but that's the basic 3 steps. And all of this, none of this is dependent on a specific framework for any of these steps. Why can't we get it all and the pony too? Why is this so difficult? And it seems like, requirements and priorities of platforms are always changing just constantly. How we do that is the core of what I want to get at here. So in order to answer that, we need to talk a little bit about the book that I alluded to in the title of this presentation, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, An Inquiry into Values by Robert Pirsig, who, by the way, is a technical writer. So for those who haven't read the book, it's kind of equal parts philosophical and autobiographical about the author's motorcycle journey across the country with his son. It gets into his experience with mental illness, his experience in academia, and the benefits of doing your own motorcycle maintenance instead of depending on somebody else to do it for you. But the important part for this talk is the concept of a connection between, in the book it's talking about technology and society, between reason and intuition, and focusing on just one side of that, just like I had that ideal solution before, that's a very purely technological solution that should be absolutely perfect. Focusing on just that can introduce kind of a false dichotomy into what we're trying to do. The way that we try to create a useful process is, we do get into the nuts and bolts of that technological side of things, but also we want that to be able to work with the people side of things as well. This does absolutely no good for us if we come up with this beautiful process and nobody can run it, or everybody's confused by it, or whatever else goes wrong. And also, if we focus on those nuts and bolts, it doesn't handle deviation as well. It doesn't handle, okay, there's been a requirement change on this part of what we want to show our clients. There's a change in a platform that one team is using that nobody else is using. If we focus on that, we end up having the whole process fall down pretty quickly. If we focus on just the human side of the process, it's great, and also we end up making a lot of more work for ourselves than we necessarily need to, where we could be automating some of that. We could go through and write all of this documentation for our APIs manually every single time, and I don't want to wish that on anybody because that takes forever. But when it gets down to it, this talk isn't absolutely 100% about making open API spec files. Lots of people know how to do it. Just like the book isn't just about turning a wrench on a motorcycle. It's about what we're trying to learn about making this whole process better and what we can learn from making this process better that we could apply somewhere else. So how do we make this thing better? Just like the premise of the book, I'm going to try to split this into 2 different parts. An incremental approach. So this is more on the technological side of things. If we make smaller changes instead of trying to institute this one beautiful, glimmering, perfect process, then we can end up learning a lot more as we go along. This is kind of the reason side of the equation. And then working with humans, the name of it kind of sounds silly because I couldn't think of a better way to describe it. Ryan Macklin did a lightning talk that I think a lot of people saw earlier that talked about our squishy human brains, which I love that. I usually call us squishy sacks of feelings. So we're very close on that. But we all have to be able to acknowledge the effect that our process has on people and acknowledge how we interact with the people in the process is going to tell us whether or not the process works well or not. And this is more of that intuition side of the equation. Lots of us have stories about management instituting just gigantic process changes happening. I worked at a plant one time where I was an engineer. Management said, okay, we are going to be doing this process this way from now on. No questions, just do it. Workers got upset, employees got upset, engineers got upset. Everybody blew off the changes and we started scrapping parts $250,000 at a time. We don't want that. So let's find better ways to not do that. So the first side of things, our idea of incrementalism. What does it solve? We don't have to rely on the idea that if you don't have a completely 100% perfect technological process put together, then it's absolutely worthless. Like, that doesn't do any of us any good. There's worth in every single little step that we can make towards that goal. We may never reach that goal at the end, but if we can keep on making those little small changes, that's still worthwhile work. It's just like we can't change the world on our own. We're not changing the world completely by taking my soda can and throwing it in the recycling. But it still doesn't mean that that work isn't important. So, don't let the great be the enemy of the good, is the saying that a former boss said to me. It can also be a hedge against unknown changes. So let's say that you get a spec for whatever that you need to do, and this isn't specific to technical writing, this could be anything. And you do all of your work, get your project done, and then at the end you get told, oh, actually this spec changed and you have to go back and do all this work. Doing these little incremental changes gives you a lot more chances to check in and see, okay, am I actually in line with what I need to do? Some people may call this agile framework. This steals some ideas from that. It can also reduce the chance of large-scale failure. If you don't have those checks as you go along to make sure that you're in line with the goal that you're trying to make, then you're working at making a less brittle process. So what does this incremental approach look like? And this is what I mean when I say the task of auto-manually creating API documentation. It's not completely automatic, it's not completely manual, but we find somewhere in the middle, and hopefully that ends up working out better. So, like the story I said about instituting the big new process in the plant, it didn't just make people angry. After that, whenever there was an unforeseen issue, there was huge problems, whole process fell over, people got called in at 2 in the morning. It was a gigantic mess. We were more susceptible to making those huge failures because we missed something in requirements that maybe we didn't get told about because nobody knew about until it was far too along in the process. And even that starts creating more bugs, more problems as we go along. So, I skipped a little ahead there. We use a manual process to learn how things actually work. It gives us a chance to debug our process. And it lets us start doing these iterative improvements. Maybe we take one little part of this manual process that we want to put together and replace it with an automatic part. Maybe we do, instead of reading through an OAS file, checking that every single field has a description, we come up with a script that does it automatically for us. And then, what does this look like specifically for API documentation? Things like standardized copy in a central location. If we have a field called user ID that we always want to have with the same description, maybe we have that in a database that we can always check. This is the one that gives us tons of time improvements, but it's a little bit more of an outlay in the beginning. Another one that we talked before is maybe we just do the automatic generation of OpenAPI spec files on its own and then manually take those along. This one's a relatively easy one. Tons of languages out there have their own packages to be able to do that automatically. Automatic posting of files, so that gets into the display part of the ideal process that I came up with before. Before, that would maybe take you 5 minutes, half an hour every time. Now you can do that automatically. All of a sudden, you start adding all these changes together, and it comes up to give a lot of improvements. So I was talking about changes in scope and complexity. The incremental approach can help deal with these changes a little bit better. We can uncover changes that we weren't expecting a lot earlier. And hopefully it reduces wasted work. Like I was talking about, you go through this whole process, at the end, somebody says, oh, actually, no, that's not really what we were trying to do. The incremental approach also, like I said, means doing something manually first. And it gets into what is programming. It is turning a manual process into an automatic process. It is automation. We're going to be more flexible handling differences in input and requirements. We'll say, when I'm doing this manually, I always got to make sure to check that this is right or this is filled in. When I do the automatic process, I need to actually take care of this. And hopefully it lets us build a more robust, ongoing automatic process. So when we get this all together, hopefully this prevents the bugs from getting into our process a little more. I love this stock photo. I think, the caption of it was "Triumphant Mouse Gnaws on Cable." And I saw that, I couldn't not put this in, so I hope you can all be your own triumphant mouse leaving this today. So now we're getting into the other side, and kind of the secret part is that this is the real core of what I wanted to get into as part of this talk. The working with humans side. What does it help? We need to all acknowledge that we're all humans full of squishy feelings. And this is the part that I see companies get wrong every single time. I have never been at a company that has not had these problems come up. I am sure that everybody else has gone through these sorts of things. If we can get people working better together, hopefully this is going to consolidate efforts between multiple teams. Another thing, like everybody's got stories about teams that just keep on butting heads and can never get working along together. Hopefully it's reducing wasted work due to misunderstandings. Communication, it's actually a good thing to do. Hopefully it's reducing conflict as well. Conflict a lot of times is stemming from misunderstandings. Not always, but that's a big part of it. And hopefully makes us happier. I'm all for being happier. I hope everybody else is too. Being happy is good. So before we get into this, I've got basically some ground rules and a little caveat about what I'm going to talk about. All of these guidelines and tips are assuming that we are all acting in good faith in our work environment. We are all acting within reasonable bounds of professional engagement and behavior. That is not always the case. So the caveat is these tricks and tips that I'm going to give you do not solve systemic imbalances in the workplace. They do not deal with systemic issues. A lot of times these communication tips may help a little bit, but they're putting a Band-Aid on a much deeper problem. In extreme cases of people acting in bad faith when it comes to communications, these may not help at all. If that is the case, there are other problems that are outside the scope of what I'm talking about to help with. This is not a full course in communication in the workplace. These are just tips and tricks to hopefully help. So what is all this about side trains at Burning Man anyway that I talked about in the description? And rest in peace, El Pulpo Mecanico, which is one of the big pieces of art out there. A lot of these tips I've started to pull from helping people at Burning Man. People see it as this gigantic party in the desert, but it has, it's legendarily a place where it's a very nice place to be, and everybody is very well equipped and resourced to deal with all sorts of problems. Turns out, no. It is one of the most harsh and inhospitable environments you've been in, and it makes everything worse. It makes communication worse. It makes conflict worse. All of this comes up. But a lot of the same skills we can apply to this. Because sometimes, what looks like a completely intractable problem, maybe you can find ways to at least solve part of that problem. So, more tools for your toolbox. We'll talk about position versus interest, the 5 whys, talking past each other, well, you're not listening to me, and getting buy-in from people. So, position versus interest. In my volunteer work, this is one that we talk about a lot. People are not typically at their most resourced to deal with problems that come up when you're at Burning Man. And sometimes this happens in the workplace too. Getting to the root of what's actually needed lets you figure out what the real issue is, and then you can start addressing that instead of trying to deal with what actually isn't the core of the problem. Some people equate this to wants versus needs, but it's not quite what I'm talking about. So, Psytrance. Let's say somebody comes up yelling, say, that camp over there needs to be shut down. They've been blasting Psytrance 24 hours a day. Personally, not my thing. I know some people love Psytrance, but so maybe that's the position, but the actual interest is, okay, I haven't been able to sleep all night. My partner's broke up with me. My camp over there keeps blasting Psytrance. I can't find my earplugs in it. And it turns into this big list of things, and now you can start picking apart what the actual problem is in a little bit better way to solve it. What does it look like when we're talking about API documentation? Maybe somebody comes to you and says, we need to make a catalog for every single field in every single endpoint in all of our services. Okay, let's try to get deeper into that. Maybe that's, well, we had a client that put in a support ticket because they thought this user ID field meant this, but it didn't actually mean it, and they put the wrong data in the field. You can start piecing that out. That ends up leading into the next thing, the 5 whys. This is actually something that was created by Sakichi Toyoda from the Toyota Motor Corporation to try to work on root cause failure analysis. So let's say something breaks down in a plant, in a process. This is a tool that you can use to work your way back and try to hopefully figure out the root cause. The basic idea is that you ask why 5 times. 5 times is a completely arbitrary number. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more, but it's a good poke to get you to think more about it. So it can also get you to help you with that position versus interest problem. And sometimes it helps you unearth needs that people didn't even realize they had. So for example, with a motorcycle, my motorcycle won't start. Why? Okay, let's see, the battery's dead. We'll ask why again. Okay, the alternator on the motorcycle isn't charging the battery. Okay, why is that? Well, the wiring on the alternator is all chewed up. Okay, why is that? Well, I see rats are getting into the garage and they're chewing the wiring. Okay, why are rats getting in the garage? Oh, I left an open bag of cat food in my garage and the rats are treating it like an open buffet. So now, maybe stopping the rats from getting in the garage solves your problem after you've fixed everything out. What does it look like for API documentation? Go back to, we need the field name to have the description username for login. So why? Well, clients are getting confused with other instances of the field name and other endpoints. So why? Well, we don't have consistency across field names and endpoints. Well, why is that? Different endpoints were created at different times by different teams, and some of them aren't here anymore, and they didn't make them the same. Okay, why is that? Well, all these different teams didn't check to see if there was prior work for all this. Okay, why is that? Well, dev teams were rushed to get a product out the door for clients and they didn't have time to check. So sometimes what you think the original problem is isn't actually the problem you have to solve. So the next one, talking past each other. Again, every single place I've worked, I have always run into this. is always a problem. A lot of times you might be talking with somebody and you feel like they're not answering your question. They're talking past you. And most of the time, if you're feeling that way, they're feeling that way too. It's almost never a one-way thing. So what causes it? How can we fix it? Are you making different assumptions? Are you assuming that a prerequisite for this project is done and they're not? Are you assuming that you're talking about project A and they're talking about project B and you're talking about completely different projects? Had that happen multiple times. How do you fix that? Sometimes it's as easy as, all right, so let me make sure that I'm understanding what you're talking about. Getting them to rewind a little bit and even just describing things as basically as you can help. Do you have different priorities? Are you really concerned about step 1 of this project, but they're concerned about step 3? Sometimes you can acknowledge on both sides what the concerns are and then start picking it apart that way. Next part, how do we get buy-in? So what's our goal? Are we trying to get people onboarded quicker? Are we trying to reduce support requests? Let's try to identify the goal in a very, very concrete way. Trying to put numbers on it if you can. Do you not have a specific goal? Make one up. Start with something. At least you have a goal to work for. And then try to make a connection between what that goal is and what you're doing. If you can say that if you give me these 2 sprints worth of time to work on going through all of our field descriptions, it's going to reduce the number of support requests we get because all of our fields are described different ways. And in this case, you do have to kind of be a little bit of a cheerleader for yourself as well. But even with all of these tools that we have in the toolbox, sometimes nobody gets what they want and nobody gets the pony. The trick is getting people to not just think but actually believe that they're being listened to and that their input matters, and hopefully you can at least do something. We can't always get the pony, but sometimes we can work our way a little bit towards it. So how are we going to try to pull this all together, and how is it going to make our process less brittle? Hopefully with all this, it's going to make communication between all the teams work a lot better. It'll make it look like all of our teams are working together in happy harmony instead of very disconnected teams. And all of a sudden, you maybe have somebody on a different team who comes up to you and says, oh, by the way, I heard about this change that's coming up. You really need to be able to take care of that. And they're like, oh, yeah, actually, I didn't hear of that. And hopefully with an incremental approach, it lets us get this documentation out there faster, more in line with how APIs are actually being created and being presented. And hopefully we're learning more about it during every step of the process. So after all this, like what have we learned? What can we take and apply to other processes, other things in our lives? If you plan a trip like they did in the book, it's never going to go completely to plan. Like something goes wrong, something breaks, you got to make a change to your plan. But hopefully we can still find something worthwhile in all the steps we're making along the way. Similarly, even if we're not getting a completely automatic process for API creation, hopefully we're making improvements and it's still worthwhile work, whatever we're working on. No process that we're making is ever in isolation. These do not exist in discrete boxes anywhere. If we can get, hopefully, the tech sides and the human sides working together a little bit better, hopefully that helps our process work better together. And a lot of times we don't necessarily get the pony we want anyways, but sometimes we just get a different pony that works out better. So big thanks to all of you for being here, and want to acknowledge Ben Perlmutter from MongoDB, who helped talk me through a lot of ideas for this presentation. Big thanks to Tech Content team back at Apex, Emily, Allison, Peter, Catherine, and Ian. I know they're all watching through the live stream, so hi everybody. And big thanks to the whole Write the Docs team and our one-person captioning machine over here who I've been absolutely in awe of the entire day, so thank you so much. Thank you all. And now I get the comfy chair too.
but you also get an interrogation.
I'll take it.
No, thank you so much for your talk. I think that a lot of people expect a very technical talk when they're hearing about APIs, and to hear it so human-focused, I really love that relationship and that connection where it doesn't have to be its own scary world that you have to study for years to get into. So thank you for that. I loved how accessible it was. We've got some API questions, so never fear if you wanted the technical stuff. The first one is from Michael. How do you solve the API versioning issue, whether in terms of presenting different versions or documenting deprecated or removed APIs?
So, obviously the ideal is we only want the most up-to-date all the time, and that's it. Obviously,
Easy.
Yeah, right, yeah. Obviously not what reality is. So kind of on the more technical side, if I remember correctly, there is actually in the OpenAPI spec some flags you can set for, okay, this endpoint is deprecated. The trick behind that, though, is to always get that set, or maybe even have a consistent way to say, in this endpoint description, it starts with the word deprecated, or have a very clear, this is version 2. You kind of want the most up-to-date and best and greatest to be the cleanest one out of it, and all the rest say that, no, this isn't actually the most up-to-date one.
Run away. Great. We've got another question. How do you come to a decision about who owns the API specifications versus the associated documentation?
That's the big question. Just the softball ones. It is so dependent on, I almost want to say, the culture of what's set up at a company. Like, I'm in a really unique position where I had been working as a software engineer and now moved over to tech content. They did not remove any of my access for putting pull requests up on any of the repos, so I can just go in and change stuff.
Don't tell the internet.
whether they approve it or not, it's another deal. It really, you have to kind of start with that first conversation about who actually do we want this to be owned by, because it could be very, very different answers between companies or even within a company. And there's a lot that goes into it. Ideally, you kind of want the documentarian part of it to almost be at the end of the line, kind of the final gate for, okay, we can make sure that copy is looking good, we've got all the information we need. But leading up to that, there's a lot more wiggle room.
Yeah, a lot of room for collaboration too, hopefully.
Yeah,
that's what we like to see. Thank you. Victor's looking for a real world example. Can you share an example where you worked with engineering or writing teams to automanually create the API documentation? Yeah,
it's, I've been going through recently a lot of starting with very, very completely manual process for, okay, we need to do our dev portal and we've got all of these endpoints that we've been writing manually for all of this time. And sometimes it just starts with, okay, I at least know where in the code to start generating an OpenAPI spec file automatically. I'm going to start with that. And then pull that file, maybe make changes manually, upload it manually, start with that. And little by little, sometimes you can get all of your services, get that step done for all the services first, or sometimes you have to go the other direction and get the whole process done for one service. But that's really the core of where I've tried to start with, and then go into, okay, how can we essentially do a linting process on this OAS file? How can we make sure that our fields are being described the right way and go from there?
Awesome, thank you. Yeah. That's a really good lead into our next question from some doc dude, which could be any of you. How do you balance that gate checking what you get from the devs, so ensuring descriptions are user-friendly, and just letting the auto process do its work, what it will, magic?
Right, and it actually gets into what I was talking about, how if you end up with a completely automatic process, it ends up being very brittle because stuff can fall through the cracks where all of a sudden, by nobody's fault, this one field got dropped, and that happens. So it is a real trick trying to find that balance. And personally, I like the idea of starting more on the manual side of things. making sure we can prove this out enough, and then once we get to a certain level of confidence in whatever step this is, then switching it over to something more automatic. Also, another big part of that is, can we actually get alerts if something is going wrong with this that we can take into account for later?
Do you want those alerts?
Yes, yeah, I do.
We have a really great question. Did you know that El Pulpo Mecanico was reborn in 2022 as El Pulpo Magnifico? He's silver and beautiful now.
Yes, I knew about El Pulpo Magnifico, but El Pulpo Mecanico still has a very, very soft, flaming part of my heart. So
we've got one audience member who's going to sleep really well, knowing that you do know that. This is a really great, just a general question. How do I get started and learn what tools to use to automate our currently manual API documentation? Another big question.
Yeah, real simple one. You can kind of attack it at a lot of different places. The one that obviously I'm a little bit biased for having done software engineering is, can you go into the code and create an open API spec file automatically? That I kind of alluded to. There's a lot of existing packages for whatever language that you're working with to say, okay, I want to import this package and then add this step to my Bazel build file, and it'll create an OAS file. That's a really informative part of the step to go with, because a lot of the changes that you want to end up making to make this a more solid process is you're going into the code, devs are going into the code, making these changes to descriptions and comments in the code. So you're getting your hands back in there one way or another and taking a look at that part, even if you're not a full, you're doing code changes constantly to this code base. You can still go in and try to get that part set up first, and then hopefully that'll open up for the rest of the process.
Hopefully, yeah. We've got one more question. We've still got a couple seconds to type one in. You can type fast. Have you ever grouped REST API automated docs by use case, or do you do it in a linear fashion?
That's a good question. I've honestly seen it done pretty well both ways. Mm-hmm. I think personally I like it a little bit better in kind of a use case sort of way, but I'd have a really hard time telling somebody that they had to do it in the use case instead of linear. Personally, there's so little in between the two for myself that I have a hard time picking between one or the other.
Good answer. Well, thank you so much. I've got no more questions. I think everybody's just basking in newfound hope for API docs. So thank you so much. Crossed. We have one more hand for Dan.
All right.
Thank you.